So, Chief Don, I want to welcome you most warmly to Kedron United Church, and I'm delighted that you could spend some time with us today. And some of us have already met you when we did the Indigenous Canada course, but perhaps you could just introduce yourself to our community. And I should let you know that not only are people in the Oshawa community going to be watching this, but we have people watching us from all across Canada and all across Ontario as well. So you'll be speaking to a broad audience today. So again, a formal welcome to Kedron United Church.
Well, first of all, I want to bring greetings and best wishes to everyone that will be following this interview, and hope that your summer will be great. And I'm very pleased to be here. And I've enjoyed my conversations with Pastor Christopher White and Jennifer Walker as well, who's a member of our community. And just want to wish everybody all the best.
That's great. And tell us who your community is.
Okay, we are the fourth largest First Nations community in Ontario, and I think it's the ninth largest in Canada. We have 11,000 members, and we are members of the Mohawk Nation. Of course, over the years, as we had engaged in warfare, we had taken in other Indigenous nations into our nation. So we're actually a mix of other nations as well. And we live on the north shore of the Bay of Quinte, which is an inland body of water from Lake Ontario. And our traditional homeland was the Mohawk Valley in Upper New York State, but on the northern shore of Lake Ontario, pretty much from Niagara to Quebec City was our traditional hunting ground. And so when Jacques Cartier came down the St. Lawrence River to Quebec in 1534, he met the St. Lawrence Iroquois people and the Haudenosaunee people, which is our confederacy of originally five nations, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and Seneca Nation. They were then referred to as the Iroquois. The French called it the English called it the Five Nations originally. When the Tuscarora Nation joined in 1723 or about that time, then of course it became known as the Six Nations because there were six different nations forming a confederate government. And so traditionally we would have been governed by 50 chiefs representing their clans. The Mohawk people have three clans, the Turtle, Bear, and Wolf. I'm a Wolf clan chief. And my family's Wolf clan unit. We are a matrilineal society, and we inherit our clans from our mothers. And so that was we settled in our traditional area, which was the birthplace of Daganawida, one of the founders of the first original Five Nations Confederacy in about 1450 AD, before Europeans came to these shores.
And you settled in the Bay of Quinte area. Was it 1789? On May
the 22nd, 1784.
1784.
But our people hunted and fished and gathered here from time immemorial. Our people have used this area.
And what led to the settlement in 1784?
Well, we were in 1664. We entered in after the English defeated the Dutch. We had treaties of peace and friendship and trade with the Dutch. Of course, we would trade furs and fish and with the Dutch in exchange for iron pots and pans and axes and shovels and anything that was made with metal and iron. We would trade with them, and so there was a treaty of peace and friendship and trade. When the English were conquered and the first treaty was actually called the Truro Wampum Treaty, which was really that our people would govern our affairs and they could govern their affairs, but the two would never interfere with each other's governance of their people. And so in 1664, the English had conquered the Dutch, and we entered into what was then a similar treaty with the English nation called the Silver Covenant Chain of Friendship. And so it was a relationship of peace and friendship, trade, and now military alliance. So then our people were brought into many different battles on the side of the English king. The American Revolution was one of them, which, of course, when England was not victor in that war, and it led to the formation of the United States, and our people then came to settle in our hunting ground because we were faithful allies of the English king. And the Americans had by that time had burned our houses to the ground.
Wow.
So Captain John Deseranto took the Fort Hunter Mohawks, which was our ancestors, to an area near Lachine, near Montreal, to encamp there for 7 years during the life of the American Revolution. They would have led forays into the Mohawk Valley and been to disrupt enemy supply lines and to be a source of intelligence for the British military. And likewise, from the Gunat-Johare Mohawk settlement, Captain Joseph Brant took their people to the Niagara area, and they encamped there at Fort Niagara for 7 years. They lived in very cramped, impoverished conditions during that time. And then with the signing of the Treaty of Paris of 1763, there was no, 1783, I meant to say, there was no opportunity for our people to regain our homeland. Our homes had been destroyed. Anyway, they had been burned to the ground. And so they, by Washington's army, and there was no opportunity to regain our homeland in the Mohawk Valley. So our people then were told by the governor to select other lands. And so we selected, John Deseranto preferred this area along the Bay of Quinte, and Captain Joseph Brant preferred the Grand River area. And so there was land set apart, 12 miles by 13 miles, which was only part of our traditional hunting ground to be a settlement for our people. But so soon after they had settled here in 1784, the land in the northern part of our township, likewise with the Grand River settlement, the land started being encroached upon by other United Empire loyalists who were also coming to settle in this area. So oftentimes they were faced with land squatters, and they were faced with timber poachers.
So history still lives today. History isn't something that happened in the past. History informs our present. And if looking at sorry, no, continue, please.
And I was talking about the military alliance, and so that was one of the first battles. So we were also involved in the earlier conquest of Canada, and which was called the French Indian Wars. We fought also on the side of the English, with Sir William Johnson and John Deseranto and Joseph Brant at Lake George, and so they were involved. And they were also, and John Deseranto was at the signing of the capitulation at Montreal of the French in 1760, when the Articles of Capitulation were drawn up. So another war was the War of 1812, because England and France were at war. They had had a lot of wars between those two countries. They were at war, so there wasn't a lot of British military support for the colonies. So Sir Isaac Rock looked to the Indians to be allies. And of course, there were famous people like Tecumseh, fought on the side of the English, and Mohawk military captains, John Brant and John Deseranto, John Brant and John Norton fought at Niagara and Queenston Heights, along with our warriors from here, went to Queenston Heights as well, because a lot of the communities were here in Six Nations were related to each other or had intermarried each other. And so there was, those two communities were always quite close to each other. And so, and then the next, of course, war, the Boer War in Africa, the Mohawk people at Akwesasne were good boatsmen. And so they were, the British wanted to took them to the Nile River in Egypt to free General Khartoum, General Gordon, who was held in captive at Khartoum. So they were in that war. Some are in the First World War, Indigenous people volunteered in numbers disproportionate to our population. They honored the treaty to be the ally of the king in times of war. And and likewise in the Second World War, the Korean War, the Gulf War, the war in Afghanistan, and in the Vietnam War, many of our people served in the U.S. Marines in that war as well. So we've had a long history of warriors being warriors in these military alliances.
And a long history of living the treaties and the agreements that
we've always honored our end of the treaty, but the vision that our ancestors had with the colonizing nation was that there would be peace and there would be friendship and trade, and both would benefit from a relationship with each other. They did not vision the injustice or the exclusion or the dispossession or the poverty that would come to our people as a result of entering into that relationship.
Could you talk a bit more about that in terms of the impact that it's had on First Nations people, and also from that sort of as we move as we're in 2021 as well, where you see the opportunities in your community and the challenges that are still there?
Well, what we see right now is that up until about maybe 1830, when there was an enemy on the horizon, when the Crown had an enemy on the horizon, it was important for the British king and their colonial leaders to polish the chain, that there be no tarnish that would damage that relationship, because if there was ever a war, they wanted to make sure they had a strong, faithful ally in the Mohawk Nation particularly. And so they appointed in the 1700s a Crown Indian agent to do all things necessary to keep the alliance strong. And the first one, of course, was Sir William Johnson, who was appointed in 1756 to be the Indian agent for the Indian superintendent of the northern region, and to interact with the Mohawk people. Of course, he married Joseph Brandt's sister, Molly Brandt. And so the goal was to keep the relationship strong. But as long as there was an enemy on the horizon, the British government did all things. There was a lot of diplomacy practiced, a lot of goodwill practiced. But after 1830, when there was no longer an enemy on the horizon, the War of 1812 had taken place. The newly formed United States government said they would never take up arms against each other again. And there was no longer an enemy on the horizon. The French had been conquered. The War of 1812 had taken place. Then there was a new policy of colonization. And so the settlers were invited to come to this part of the country to get free land, and the Crown was promoting colonization. And so oftentimes there was no agreement whatsoever made, or any thought of making agreements with the indigenous people who were the owners of the land. People just came and went on the land and settled there. And so there were complaints made about infringements to the Crown about these. The Crown did nothing. And then as time went on, then a new policy emerged. The Indians now, instead of being regarded as faithful allies, were now an Indian problem, because so therefore the Crown had to develop a new policy, and the policy was then that one of assimilation, where the Native people would only have Indian blood, but they would speak English. They would adopt Christianity. They would dress in a manner that the English people did, and adopt their ways. Our people, and so the men were to become farmers and mechanics, and the women were to learn to have domestic skills, and to work in the gardens and raise the family. But our people had already done that anyway before European contact. We were an agricultural people, so we didn't really need to learn how to grow food. We had done that for centuries. So then there was to eradicate the Indianness of the person. Residential schools were established, the first one being the Mohawk Institute, which is now in Brantford, Oshawa Reserve, near Oshawa First Nation, near Brantford, Ontario. And that school was the first. It was a day school, started in 1826 by funds from the New England Company, and then in 1831 it became the Mohawk Institute, ever the first residential school in Canada, and it operated until about 1870. And so children that were sent to school there to basically take the Indianness out of the person. And so they were forced to speak English. They were forced to adopt the ways of the English people. And so the goal was to eradicate the nationhood of the people, their language, their spirituality, and then, of course, the title to their land. And so there were many frauds and abuses that took place historically in the relationship. And that was one of the reasons why the Crown appointed an Indian superintendent, was to stop the land frauds and abuses that had occurred in the 1700s. And of course, one of the proclamations of the king to prevent that from happening was the Royal Proclamation of October the 7th, 1763, where only the Crown could purchase title to Indian land, and individuals would not be allowed to have any land dealings with the Indigenous people. But oftentimes the Crown failed in its part to do what they were to follow their instructions, and the abuses continued. As a result, now we have many, many land claims that are unsettled because of the frauds and abuses. And oftentimes the Crown would even use rum and in the discussions to use intoxication to get agreements signed. And so the archival records document all that. So that was the relationship. But so we've always honored our part to be an ally of the Crown in times of war. But the Crown has failed quite often in its part to do what was right by our people.
So when you're looking at the community today, what's your feeling in terms of the opportunities and the challenges? And one of the things you talked to me about was the difference, or in an earlier conversation, was the difference between the business park and the infrastructure that your community has compared to one literally just down the road. And
well, right now, Ontario and First Nations communities, there are 64 communities. There are 64 boil water advisories, I think, in 26 different First Nations communities. So Mohawks, the Bay of Quinte here would be one of them. The other one would be the Oneida First Nation and the Iroquois Nation. Then there's several others throughout Ontario that they don't have. So we've been working on a number of years to get water lines built, a water treatment plant. And we have about maybe half of the reserve, a little bit better than half of our community service now with safe drinking water, but there still is a lot more work to do. And of course, these projects cost millions of dollars to build water lines. So
let me be clear.
What we're faced with right now is the effects of climate change. We have droughts, and all the wells in the community are goody wells, which means when there isn't a lot of rain, the streams dry up, and then there's no water to recharge the groundwater. So then the wells go dry. The pumps burn up, they burn out, they suck up mud and burn out, and then people don't have water of any kind. And then usually the groundwater that's here now is very polluted.
So just so my congregation is absolutely clear here, in Southern Ontario, right in our community, in our province, your community, half your community does not have safe drinking water.
That's correct. Or a reliable source of water. It's a quantity problem as well as a quality problem. Many of the wells are low yielding wells. They're less than 3 gallons per minute. So when there's droughts, and because there's a shallow drinkable aquifer that needs a significant amount of rain to recharge, quite often if it doesn't rain and we have dry periods, the streams dry up. And when the streams dry up, then there's a corresponding groundwater deficiency, and many people's wells go dry.
I am honestly speechless that this is still an issue in Canada, in Ontario. I am speechless that this is still continuing.
Well, in southeastern Ontario in 2017, when we had the major drought, there was 60,000 people were affected by that drought. But one of the areas that were the most severely impacted was the Salmon River area that goes through our community.
So if you live in Belleville, you're going to get water. So what's
they have a municipal water supply.
They have a municipal water supply. So what is the difference between Belleville and your community? This is what I think we don't understand.
Okay, we have a municipal water supply in a partnership with Desron for part of the town of Desron for part of the reserve. And then we also have a water treatment plant that services part of the reserve. But we just lack money for the water distribution pipes to service the rest of the reserve. And so we're looking at a next project that's going to cost $30 million, but it still will not service the entire reserve. So that's something we're working on in a partnership with Infrastructure Canada, but we will still lack a lot of money to service the additional roads that need servicing. There, in a large community as ours, there's growth pressures to develop subdivisions because there's a limited land base, so that there's a place, service lots for people to build houses, like service lots, so they can build houses and have the very basic necessary infrastructure of water and sewage to service their home. I mean, most houses could not operate anywhere in Canada without adequate water and sewer services.
Oh, of course not.
Sewer services.
And I'm sure some people are thinking right now, well, doesn't the provincial government play a role in this in terms of municipal transfers the way they do with, say, the city of Belleville? So what role does the provincial government play here?
Well, historically, the province has always said the reserve is federal jurisdiction, that Ottawa should look after it. So oftentimes Canada will recently, so over the years, up until a few years ago, if we applied for a provincial grant, the reserves were not eligible to apply simply because we were seen to be federal land and federal jurisdiction. And then the province didn't have a responsibility to deal with it. It was all Ottawa's. But Canada has also given money to millions of dollars to the provinces to develop basic infrastructure. So usually they can, now they'll open it up for example, at one point in time, you could build an $8 million museum through a grant. You could apply under that category of funding, but nothing to deal with a municipal water treatment plant or a sewage treatment plant or the development of a service subdivision. And so Ontario does not fund water projects for reserves.
Wow. I don't think that most people know that. I honestly don't.
So there should really be a partnership, I think, with Ottawa and the public to deal with the backlog in safe drinking water. Carolyn Bennett stood up in the United Nations and said that safe drinking water is a human right.
Yes, it is.
And so it's the provision of a basic human right to so many Indigenous people in the province of Ontario is sadly lacking.
So is there a role for a community like ours to assist in any advocacy, to speak to our MPs, our MPPs? Where would a community like ours be able to be helpful and supportive in dealing with issues like this?
Yeah, people can write to Ottawa and write letters, and they can file it in file 13 and say, yes, thank you very much for your letter. We recognize this problem. And then they'll tell you where all they've spent money, but it's not enough to deal with the need that's there. The need that is staggering in the billions of dollars. And so I think there needs to be a government-public partnership. And it can't be just push your MP to make noise, because obviously there's many things that are competing for the resources that Ottawa has. There can be wars, or there can be natural disasters that they have to make that the priority. Then all these other things get pushed off to another day to deal with. And so that's what's happened to a large, but recently the Liberal government has, invested millions of dollars to help with get caught up on water. But as the Prime Minister said, there still is a lot of work to do, and it will require billions of dollars to do it. There's a lack of housing. There's a lack of, some of them lack a water treatment, their first water treatment. Some of them, the water treatment plant does not meet the Ontario regulation in terms of safety. And so there could be walker-in situations occurring because of the aging of the plant, and it's just not been modernized. And then some places don't have a water treatment plant at all. And then, of course, the longer you push it into the future and delay, the cost keeps climbing, and many First Nations do not have the money to pay their fair share of these projects, pay their share of the projects.
So when you talk about finances, what is the financial base for your community? For instance, in Belleville, you know, there's property taxes, all sorts of, there's a tax base. Is it similar? Like, but it's a province-wide impact, or municipal and province. So how does the system work in your community? Because I know it's very different.
Well, first of all, I think when we look at the land and the resources that were taken from our people by the colonizing, to make a home for the colonizing nation, First Nations were never paid a fair and equitable price for any of that land or any of those resources, and that generates enormous amount of wealth and economic prosperity for the dominant society. In terms of own source revenue, we have a subdivision that we collect rents from, about $1 million a year. It all goes back into housing because we finance our own mortgages. And so here we lend you $1. We have $1 in the bank to back that up. It's not based on credit margins. We also have to guarantee other mortgages with the Bank of Montreal market-based housing program to address the housing need. And of course, these loans have to be backstopped by MBQ as a guarantor of those loans, because the bank can't take security on Indian land. We have some investments, we have some commercial leases, and we have a revenue sharing agreement with the Ontario Lottery Corporation for 1.7% of all gaming revenue in Ontario, and that helps, but that goes to all the reserves of the 133 First Nations in Ontario. Then we have an investment in wind power and solar energy and commercial leases. Then we have fees for garbage collection and fees for daycare and fees for diners club, that sort of thing.
But what there isn't as of yet is the funding that you need to provide the full infrastructure for your community.
No, because when you have 25 people, we have 11,000 members, close to 11,000, and we have 2,500 living on the reserve, and then there's about maybe another 2,200 would be members, and about another 500 or so would be non-native spouses who are married to our members.
So I want to come back to we heard the terrible news about the bodies that were discovered in British Columbia, and the United Church apologized for the residential schools back in the late 1990s, but we're still living out and trying to live out reconciliation. So from your perspective, what does it mean to live out reconciliation from our community with your community? What does reconciliation as a nation mean from your perspective?
Well, first of all, it means that First Nations should not be living in third world conditions with a lack of housing, the lack of basic needs like safe drinking water, housing, long-term care, or health care. Those are our basic human rights. And so many First Nations are lacking those essential things. And there should not be the degree of children taken into care because of the lack of basic needs. Right now, many of the First Nations people many people are doing very well and have, completed university and have graduated, and that we've graduated over 2,000 people at the university and college level from our membership. And usually most of those people have, good incomes now and jobs and can afford a mortgage because they have enough income to pay the loan back. But there's also about 30 or 40% of the community that's not their reality. Their reality is that they're poor. They have very low incomes. Sometimes they don't have a lot of education or even opportunity to be educated because of the lack of funds that are available for post-secondary education. And really, you can't get too far now if you don't have a post-secondary education anywhere in this country. And so first, though, there's funds lacking for post-secondary education. Most of them cannot afford to find an affordable place to live because there's, first of all, a general shortage of housing everywhere, no matter what your income is, and particularly affordable housing. So people that are at the lower income scale or in poverty find it very, very hard to find a place to live, to put a roof over their families' heads. And so those are the challenges. Then, of course, the lack of, well, there can be money for counseling, but I think it has to start with housing, because everybody needs a roof over their head, particularly children. And so right now, a lot of children are taken into care. It's neglected if the parents cannot afford to house their children. They may love their children. There may be no other form of abuse, and the only thing is that they're poor and struggling. And I think I read somewhere that even in Ontario, 40% of the children that live in this province are dependent on a food bank to have food security.
Yes, I've seen similar
numbers. And Canada did agree, and presumably Canadians did agree to tackle the issue of poverty, as being one of the important goals of the government to achieve. But the poverty has not been corrected; it still exists, and as affecting the well-being of a number of families. And the other thing is that disproportionately Indigenous families.
So what I'm hearing is there's still the need for a massive shift in the attitude of government and of a nation, of Canada, the country of Canada.
I think it's a collective responsibility, because everybody benefits from living on this land, on the land, and in what that land generates in terms of economic activity and prosperity in this country, and everybody benefits from that. And so I think there is, First Nations, we need more. Well, we appreciate the gestures to lower the flag, in honor of the children, to place shoes on the steps of the legislatures and the churches, and that's all well and good. But and to not celebrate Canada Day during the pandemic anyway. But I guess what's the resolve to make it better? So some of the leaders are calling for ReconciliAction, not just reconciliation, ReconciliAction. So reconciliation has taken the form of apologies, gestures of lowering the flag, saying we support Indigenous people, but that's as far as it goes. But the reality is, if you're going to build houses, it will take money to build houses. It's just a reality. The lumber is not free at any lumber yard. There's no mill that operates to provide lumber at affordable prices for Indigenous people. Whatever the market prices are, that's what everybody pays.
And it's gone through the roof.
So everybody cannot afford the affordability of a home. There isn't. First Nations can only go so far in debt. There's healthy debt and unhealthy debt levels. And so you can't take out a loan if you don't have the means to pay it back. And so if you're going to borrow money, you have to demonstrate you have sufficient own source, reliable income to be able to pay that loan back. And so many First Nations are not there in there. And there's so many pressing needs, like with safe roads, post-secondary education, housing, subsidizing healthcare for a large segment of the populations that are still quite poor. And so that's the challenge that every local government chief and council face.
Well, Chief Don, this is the beginning of a conversation, not just one conversation. The beginning of a relationship for us.
So what I would like to see is there to be a foundation established, maybe an account at the Bank of Montreal that could be put in there, and then the government challenge to match funds to address, safe drinking water, housing, long-term care, those types of things. So I've always said, if the government could afford and the public could afford to build a place to take them over, to send them away and take them away, maybe it's time that they built a place to bring them home.
And that is a perfect way to end our first conversation, and to remember ReconciliAction is what is needed. I just want to thank you so much.
Do you know, Hazel McCallum, one the mayor of, I think, Mississauga, she said she wanted to do something in her community. And I think she said everybody gave a toonie once in a while. Things could be better. It takes people acting together collectively to make things better. So when you place all the burden on the government, you won't see it. It'll happen gradually, but people, many generations will die and never see it. And, and right now there, First Nations, there's at least 6 communities, First Nations communities that want to build a long-term care facility in their communities so they can bring their people home. So they were always, the people that went to residential school or the 60 schools were always taken away into somebody else's community. Often all they really, really want is just the opportunity to be educated in their own community, to learn their language, their traditions among their own people, and to feel at home among their own people, and that where their culture is. Now, I know the province of Ontario did provide money to build a long-term care facility for the Chinese people and the other Indigenous cultures that are in the cities. And the same can be done we have an opportunity now to build a long-term care facility. The pandemic has really impacted on the cost of construction significantly. What we had thought we could build for 30 million is going to now cost 49 million to build.
Wow.
So we've got to find ways and means to make up that difference. And of course, we have no control over the price of steel or lumber or cement blocks or contractor pricing or how it's impacted electrical supplies, all that sort of thing. But that is the Class C estimate did jump from 30 million up to 49 million because of the pandemic impact on pricing. I wonder sometimes if the forestry industry is being managed well, or it's just being extracted for whoever's got the biggest dollar gets it all. And I know right now a lot of lumber and stuff that's manufactured in Ontario, the 2x4s, the 2x6s, and 2x8s, and the plywood and stuff is all manufactured in Ontario, but yet it's being shipped to foreign markets because it brings a big dollar. And so there's not even enough kept back here in the province for domestic supply at a reasonable price. And I think there needs to be reform in how that's all managed.
I don't disagree. I know the prices for everything have just got skyrocketed beyond belief. So as
it's made the poverty worse for people that were already poor.
No, exactly. So again, Chief Don, this has been an honor, and thank you so much for sharing your time, because I've certainly learned a lot today. So I'm going to say thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, and all the best, everyone.